Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. It looks like I don't have a co-host today, but I do have a guest. Julia Doubleday of the Gauntlet is coming back. How have things been for you, Julia?
Hello, things have been good over here. Thanks for having me back. How are you doing?
Oh, it's really my pleasure to have you back. I enjoyed the first show so much. Thank you for coming back.
Of course.
Um, I am doing a little better than I have been. I'm sort of struggling through the depression I've been dealing with. My wife's cat died
Oh,
last Sunday.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah, so we've been trying to move on despite that since then. Fortunately, my cat is giving her lots of love, so she's not alone. I've been really thinking a lot lately, though, about an article that ran in The Guardian by, and this is what was so weird about it, a health reporter for their Australian publication, based on a single source, the chief medical officer of the province of Queensland, based on a single study that wasn't published or peer-reviewed.
Right.
And this justified a major headline and an international pickup in their main publication, despite under a headline saying long COVID isn't real, basically.
Right. So this example is a really good microcosm of how propaganda actually functions. It's not so much about lying to you. It's about being really political about choosing who you get to hear from and how much those stories are elevated. So this one study, if you can call it a study, it was based on text messages. No patients came into any office. No patients were tested for anything. It was like a self-reported sort of text message study, and with really no guarantee of even like who was in what group, who had COVID, who had flu. And what the study found was that people had significant symptoms after flu, similar to the way that they have significant symptoms after COVID. But
because let's remember that the flu is also a tremendously dangerous, disabling disease.
I think what we're actually learning is that the minimization of flu for so many years was also harmful to public health. Not so much the other way around.
What I've really been thinking about, I hate to derail us so quickly, what I've really been thinking about since COVID started is, oh my gosh, we're still going through the Spanish flu pandemic all these years later.
Yeah, well, so one of the things we've really learned, a lot of people who have been aware of post-viral illness for years have really been marginalized and told that it's not real and told not to talk about it. What we're finding out because of COVID and because of this tremendous burden on the public, sorry, I shouldn't say burden, but you know what I mean? Yeah, it's a public health burden, you know. What we're finding is that viruses can create long-term health problems in ways that we didn't previously understand, and we didn't know how common they were. So for example, we're finding that COVID is neuroinvasive and increases your risk of dementia. It increases your risk of all kinds of neurological issues. And flu is not neuroinvasive. So it's a different virus. It's not as dangerous as COVID, but it can still increase your risk of Alzheimer's. And it can do all kinds of things that we're only just now finding out about. So think about how much healthier society might be if we just had airborne infection control and we were reducing the spread of all of these viruses. But I do want to get back to your original question about this study. So this study, of course, as you said, it's not peer reviewed. It's not very rigorous.
Not been published.
Thousands and thousands and thousands of studies about COVID, post-COVID, and long COVID that are quite rigorous and that find repeatedly over and over again that there are significant post-COVID health issues, you know, associated with infection with the virus.
And that it should be said, many of these studies have been covered in The Guardian. Mm-hmm. And this story, with its dramatic headline, is completely at odds with all of that coverage. But it seems to be privileged in such a manner that people are going to ignore all that other coverage.
it is absolutely privileged. And we saw this exact same pattern repeating with the anti-mask propaganda. So we've had many, many studies showing that masks work and masks reduce illness, and specifically what types of masks are best to reduce COVID infections. And then there was this one study that got this huge amount of attention that said, hey, masks actually don't work. And if you read the study, what you find out is that they looked at, well, it was actually a review of a bunch of different studies. And these studies, most of them, if not all of them, I think actually took place before 2020, before COVID even existed. Let's start there. Secondly, what the studies found was that people weren't adhering to proper mask wearing in some cases. In other cases, what they found was they were looking at like doctors who wore masks at work, but then didn't wear them in their day-to-day life, and they would still get sick. And it's like, well, yeah, I mean, if you don't wear the mask in your day-to-day life, then you're still going to get sick from like being in a public space, but you're not then transmitting it to your patients. Also, that's like also important. But anyway, so the people who really like promoted this study and put it on the front page, and then the people who referenced this study, it was a Cochrane review, actually. So the people who referenced this Cochrane review, they did not read it. They don't know what's in it. But because it was this huge headline, they just say, oh, it's been proven masks don't work. And this is the same thing we're seeing again with, oh, it's been proven long COVID isn't real, which was an actual headline in the New York Post. The Guardian had like a somewhat nicer headline that was like, oh, it's not that different, from other post-viral things. The New York Post actually said it's fake. It's not.
Well, the Guardian's headline was "Stop talking about long COVID. It's no worse than the flu. Symptoms are no worse than recovering from the flu."
Well, that's a very telling title. I think the overall goal here for minimizers is just stop talking about it. Like, don't talk about it. We don't want to hear about it. It is a really major problem for the idea of all of us just going back to normal and avoiding any mention of COVID. And that's going to be fine. It's a really major problem for that so many people are getting disabled. And the only way they can continue to get people to double down and accept this constant risk of reinfection, and not even risk, this constant certainty that you're going to be reinfected, is to tell you that the long COVID patients are crazy, or they're not real, or they're lying, or it's something that used to happen, but it doesn't anymore. That's another new pivot of like the disinformation.
One I was seeing the other day in relation to a otherwise unimportant and unpleasant bit of Twitter discourse was, oh yeah, long COVID is real. I just don't believe we should be listening to we should be believing people's self-diagnoses.
Yeah, well, 99% of doctors have no idea what long COVID is.
Exactly,
so that way.
And I mean, how do they think that these things get discovered in the first place without patients self-diagnosing? Something's wrong with me, and the doctor's wrong when they say they're not. Right. That nothing's wrong with me.
And when I say, doctors, quote unquote, don't know about long COVID, keep in mind that this is because there's so much misinformation coming from the top. So it's not just they're not seeing the symptoms of long COVID. They're seeing the symptoms of long COVID all over the place. They are just not connecting it with long COVID. So, for example, I see cardiologists tweeting, oh my gosh, so many young patients with heart disease, they need to eat vegetables. And then if you reply and you say, here's a study, and it shows that COVID drastically increases your risk of cardiac issues, heart disease, heart attacks, strokes, they'll just deny it. They just don't think it's real. And part of the reason that they're in denial about it, one, a lot of them have very conservative politics generally, and they're somewhat of COVID deniers. But two, it's pieces like this that are in the media. They see circulating all the time. Oh, you know what? There was just some new study that came out. They don't look into it. They don't know what it is. They don't know who did it. They don't know anything about it other than the headline, which says long COVID isn't real. And that's enough for them because they don't want to deal with it.
And yet there is a professional culture among doctors of thinking very highly of their opinions on things, and that they frequently believe they are right in their diagnoses.
Yes.
And the best way to really describe it is to go back to the moment from MASH where Henry Blake looks at Hawkeye Pierce and says, you know the difference between doctors and God? God doesn't think he's a doctor.
I like that. Yes. I mean, if you want to look at sort of like the history of chronic illnesses, so MS, for example, which we all take very seriously as a real disease now. And we also
Yes.
know that it's caused by the Epstein-Barr virus now, which again is like another one of these, newer realizations that, oh, viruses are causing these other long-term issues. MS was believed to be psychological for decades until the MRI was invented. And then the MRI was invented and they got to look in the brains of the MS patients and they're like, oh yeah, there is something going on in there. After all, we were wrong.
It's not supposed to have all these pretty colors.
Yeah. Right. So, but that's true for almost all chronic illnesses, is that even on an individual level, like the average time it takes for someone to actually get a chronic illness diagnosis is usually like a decade or more. And in that time, usually patients become quite familiar with what's going on with their own body. They reach out to support groups. They learn about what this chronic illness is doing to them through other patients. And that's really what's been happening in the long COVID community as well, because there's so few doctors who are actually educated about it. I mean, for myself, I had COVID for the first time in November. I had a very bad time with it. I was sick for a month and I have some underlying conditions, so I kind of knew it wouldn't be great. I got Paxlovid, but two pieces of misinformation I got from doctors. One, the first doctor I saw said I wouldn't need Paxlovid because for everybody, it's just like a cold now.
Oh my God.
True, and really wasn't true for me. And the second doctor, I had to go back to the doctor because I was having like severe shortness of breath following exercise for months after COVID. And the first doctor I saw was like, oh, you have bronchitis. I was like, I don't have bronchitis. I have this I don't even have an acute illness. I don't have a cough. I don't have a sore throat. Anyway, so it's like quite clear that they don't know anything about post-COVID health effects.
Well, and doctors don't like to admit what they don't know either. In 1847, a doctor in Hungary did a mortality review of children's hospitals in what was then the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And he compared the hospitals where doctors and nurses and orderlies frequently washed their hands from between being with a patient and going to do something else, and then doing that other thing and going back to be with a patient. So you were with a patient, you washed your hands before you did something else. You did something else, you washed your hands before you went back to being with a patient. They found that fewer patients died at hospitals where the caregivers washed their hands.
Okay.
Now, this was hugely controversial at the time. There was a study. There was a review of the study by a European medical journal that really didn't understand the underlying conclusions that were being reached and just sort of missed the ball and said, well, we already knew this disease was contagious. What is this proving? And then it's totally missing the idea that if you wash your hands, let fewer people get sicker and die because you're not spreading it all around your hospital.
Right. I mean, I don't know if we talked about this last time, the Semmelweis stuff.
This is Ignaz Semmelweis, yes.
Yeah. So he ended up dying in a mental institution.
Yes.
The doctors were so mad that he was saying to wash their hands. But it's really not even the only example of that in the history of medicine. I also found out recently that, John Snow, who's the one who realized that cholera was spread in the water, and he's quite famous for doing this Broad Street pump experiment where he showed people who were going to this pump were getting cholera. People who were going to get their water from one pump were getting cholera. And I knew all about that because he's, quite famous for this. But I didn't know that the reason that this guy was like out doing this sort of like one-man experiment was because he did not agree with the London Health Board that said it was miasma, meaning like basically like airborne, honestly. Yeah. It's kind of funny we've come full circle because miasma isn't real. They didn't know what germs were, but at the same time, some of the way that they built buildings to have really good ventilation because of miasma actually work well for airborne infection control. regardless, that's not how cholera is spread. So he did this experiment and he showed that it was waterborne, and the Health Board of London rejected his conclusions. And they were like, no, we still think it's miasma. So it wasn't like right after that, everyone was like, okay, it's waterborne. We know that now.
Yeah.
They still doubled down because there's a really strict hierarchy in medicine. It's a very authoritarian culture.
Yes.
And it's not like you get to have your own opinion about things. It's sort of like being a soldier. It's like you get your marching orders from the top, and that's how it works. And sometimes that can be a good thing because you're not supposed to have your own opinions about how like the body works. But in this case, where there's a really, really quick period of a lot of new information coming out, and people at the top are not absorbing that information, it's not being communicated downward, it creates a really big problem.
Well, it's like the people at the top are operating on stuff 20 to 50 years old, which we see in our politics as well, when it seems like our leaders are operating on information about drugs and crime and American ideas of social issues as if it were 20 to 50 years ago.
Well, and I think it's not about the data at the end of the day. Like, it's so ideological, and all of it just sort of aligns with what the donor class wants and preserving this certain economic structure that we have. So it's kind of unsurprising that what we've ended up seeing throughout this ongoing pandemic COVID crisis is just the normalization of mass infection, the normalization of disabling people, and essentially just trying to sweep it under the rug so we can go back to normal. No new benefits for workers, no new protections for workers. Like, all of this is basically just like the wildest dream of the libertarians.
Not just back to normal, but to actually undermine all public health progress since Semmelweis.
Right.
Because we're not just seeing a simple reaction against COVID protocols. We've seen this reaction against public health protocols of all sorts, from measles vaccinations to even doctors masking in medical situations together, where where somebody was saying that some doctor had actually said to them, "It's insulting to treat your colleagues like vectors of infection."
There are all kinds of stories like that, and I do think we've gone in the wrong direction, and it's very much the result of
well, you mentioned the media and you mentioned the donor class. Let's remember that the donor class owns our media, and it is their plaything.
Right.
Which is why they lay people off anytime there's good news coverage of any subject at all. If you've noticed, the layoffs seem to come right after a burst of really good journalism somewhere. Somebody actually breaks a story that matters, and then a whole bunch of reporters get laid off.
I think that people have an exaggerated idea of what kind of independence, any media outlets at this point really have. And if we go back to the beginning of the pandemic, one thing that's like really important to know about is the Great Barrington Declaration. So the Great Barrington Declaration, this was like a big meeting that took place in Massachusetts at the headquarters of the American Institute for Economic Research. So if that gives you an idea of how concerned they are of public health, this is the organization that was holding this meeting. If Jeffrey Tucker, if you're familiar with him.
Yes.
Yeah.
I did a show with Walker Bragman about Jeffrey Tucker.
Yes, he is really the expert on this guy and on Brownstone. I only just benefit from the research that he does. But the Brownstone Institute is also Jeffrey Tucker's baby. It's this like far right libertarian creepy organization. He does stuff like
funded out of Chucky Koch's pocket, everybody.
Yeah, he does stuff like say we shouldn't have child labor laws. Children should be able to smoke cigarettes. So like that's the kind of libertarian he is. And like the Great Barrington Declaration
before the FDA and Fair Labor Act sort of libertarians.
Yeah. So Jeffrey Tucker was working as the editorial director and vice president of the American Institute for Economic Research when the Great Barrington Declaration meeting took place. Yes. In this meeting, a bunch of right-wing doctors, researchers, all kinds of people that they use in media coverage and sort of pretend that they're these, objective sources when in fact they're really buddy with these massively rich libertarians. They had this meeting and they were like, what's the best way for us to handle COVID? And they were like, well, the best way to handle COVID is let it rip. We'll get herd immunity, and vulnerable people can just protect themselves, which again is not how public health works. And that's what we're trying to do now. And people like myself who are trying to not get COVID, it's massively expensive. So a lot of people can't even afford some of the stuff I do, like buy a lot of tests and have HEPA filters and all this stuff. It's massively difficult. It's because there's so much top-down propaganda telling everyone that COVID is safe and COVID is fine. It's just a constant negotiation with everyone around you to try to not get infected by them.
And of course, let's remember that vulnerable people will protect themselves.
Right.
Is the euphemism before Dr. Fauci's slightly more honest, vulnerable people will fall by the wayside.
Yes,
which is still a euphemism for vulnerable people will die and we don't care.
Yeah, correct. But so I think it's important to point out how early this was really the focus of the libertarians, that the focus was there shouldn't be a public health response. Vulnerable people should be on their own, and we will get herd immunity by infecting everyone. That didn't turn out to be true. That's really the linchpin, like the center of all of the reopening, let it rip strategy in the Republican side and the Democrat side. So the Republican side of herd immunity was let it rip immediately, let all the vulnerable people die, and we go back to normal. The Democratic side was wait for the vaccines, get vaccinated, then let it rip, and then we'll go back to normal. Neither one of these sides was correct, because from the very, very beginning, you had some scientists and doctors who were disagreeing with what was being pushed in the press, this idea that once you get infected or vaccinated, you won't get COVID. Or once you get infected and vaccinated, you won't get COVID again. That didn't turn out to be true. And we knew from the very beginning that COVID was really, really good at mutating around immunity. And some scientists at the very beginning pointed out that our immune system was not good at responding to this virus and creating durable immunity to it in the future. So both sides relied on this idea that we would get permanent or long-term immunity to COVID, and it's not true. So instead, what you're being forced to accept is forever reinfections with this virus that is showing a lot of problematic long-term health issues.
And it seems like that because of the way the virus interacts with the immune system, it seems like you're actually more likely to get COVID the more often you get COVID.
So it's a bit more complicated than that, because everyone's immune system is sort of responding differently. I will say that there's a ton of evidence at this point that at least some subset of people who get COVID end up with immune systems that are dysregulated, that are not fully functioning well, and that this isn't rare. It's not like it's like, oh, 1 in a million people this happens to. It's also pretty consistent across long COVID patients that they have a very dysregulated immune system. And one thing you'll see from the very beginning, there were a couple really prominent immunologists who denied that there could be any immune system impacts from COVID. Their names are Francois Balloux and Marc Veldhoen. From the very beginning, they were like, there's no immune system effects. This is total bullshit. It's not real. Even they have had to change their tune, and more recently have said, you can't show me a study where there's immune damage to patients that don't have long COVID. Okay, so that's basically a tautology, because long COVID is basically just means I got long-term harmed by COVID. So what he's saying is, you can't show me a study of people that weren't long-term harmed by COVID that got long-term harmed by COVID. It's a logical.
There's an extremely small subset of people who have a heart problem because they got the cold. We don't talk about a long cold, but at the same time, it exists. And cold medicine can actually kill you if you have high blood pressure, and we don't tell people this most of the time.
I think it's also confusing to people, because when we talk about, okay, COVID drastically increases your risk of heart attack, increases your risk of diabetes, autoimmune disorder, stroke, all these things, people may sort of put it in the basket of like, well, anything can kill you. You know, like, oh, some people are allergic to peanuts and they die from that. It's like, what we have
smoking is bad for me, and I smoke all the time.
Yeah. What we should be communicating is that these outcomes are not rare at all. And you're also being expected to get reinfected in a lot of cases in a matter of months with this virus, for the next few decades. And like nothing we know about the amount of damage this virus does tells us that it's something we could get 20 times in 20 years and like have a good, clean bill of health. Like it's just completely unscientific.
Oh, and I totally agree. And I'm going to take this moment to read a comment from the chat. Thank you for covering this. I still can't get my head around how much of the indie quote left unquote went with the COVID contrarianism. I'll never forgive Blumenthal and Dorr, among others, for taking that line. And thank you, Ross, for paying attention. I appreciate that. And I'm glad you mentioned Jimmy Dore, because this comes back to the question of billionaire money. There was some coverage of this. Jimmy Dore was on a list of people who were taking money that was allegedly to promote journalism from a charity run by a billionaire named Peter Allard. I don't know anything about Blumenthal. I know that Blumenthal's employee, Aaron Mate, was on the list of people who were getting money from this group, as was Jen Dyes, who stopped taking the money when it became clear that the money was being increased or increasingly tied to the kind of COVID contrarianism, to use Ross's term, that Peter Allard wanted to see. And Dore has since confessed to taking the money and saying it's no big deal, everybody did. Jen Dyes went public saying, yes, I took this money too, and I stopped taking it when they started tying it to our COVID coverage. And the fact that people are still taking this money shows that they are willing to tie it to their COVID coverage. And that's why I can't speak for anybody but Jimmy Dore, but that's why Jimmy Dore took the direction he did. And lots of people follow his lead.
Yes, but I don't think that we should underestimate the degree to which some of these people who like predominantly are somewhat privileged white men, like sort of ideologically already agree with this. So I think to them, the reason they think that taking the money isn't a big deal is because they think, well, it's not like someone gave me a sack of gold and I was like, now I'm going to change my opinion. They're like, I already agree that like vulnerable people should be left to die. And like, so of course, why not take the money, And like, they don't conceptualize exactly that that's what they're saying. I don't think. And part of the reason for that, again, is that there's been this like very, very successful, as I said, top-down propaganda operation to get people to think of public health as something that affects them personally and that they personally do. So that whole thing about you do you wear a mask if you want, I wear a mask if I, don't want, like that whole concept that seemed like very foreign to us in 2020 has become completely normalized. And I think there are a couple reasons it went down so easy with a lot of people who are prominent on the sort of podcasty left. One is just, quite frankly, a lot of them are relatively privileged. So they're not actually living out the reality that people who are super medically vulnerable, honestly, medically vulnerable at all, people who are frontline workers, people who can't take paid sick days. I mean, over and over and over again, what you'll see is that the support for mitigation is much, much higher in less privileged groups. So that is sort of the opposite of what the press has continually told us or represented it as. But the poorest people are the most in favor of mitigations. The most marginalized groups are more in favor of mitigations, and they're also at higher risk for long COVID. And they're also living out this reality of like, if you go on the long COVID forums, what you'll find is people saying like, I saw somebody a few weeks ago, they had a job, they got long COVID they got COVID and they had to take 3 weeks off work. They don't have any paid sick leave. They were incredibly like me. I took 3 weeks off work and I had paid sick leave, but not everybody has that. And then they forced themselves to go back to work, but they already hadn't made enough money to pay their rent that month. So they get evicted. Yeah. Then she started driving for Uber, but she started to develop long COVID symptoms. She was too sick to drive for Uber. And she was saying like, I don't know what I'm going to do. I'm going to get kicked out of this hotel. So, like that's a reality that like a lot of the podcast left, not only of course is not experiencing themselves, but they don't even know anyone who's experiencing that. People who are in the upper middle class and people who are able to take paid sick leave, like they don't also worsen their symptoms continually by continually having to go drive for Uber for 12 hours,
And while the built-in defense, which is to some degree legitimate, is, well, these aren't rich neighborhoods. These are middle-class neighborhoods. It just costs a lot to own a house in California, crowd. I mean, that defense is true up to a point, but at the same time, we're talking about people who can afford to own $1 million houses in California.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think it's even up to debate that like your average like lefty famous podcaster has more money than like the people they're talking to. So there's that, and then there's also
well, if you want to be brutal about class, because people love to be class reductionists. If you want to be brutal about class, then Jimmy Dore is the owner proprietor of Four Door Productions. The man is a boss, not a worker.
Right. And so there's this sort of like inherent fact that they're not really experiencing the bad outcomes of constant COVID reinfection. Although that's not really true, because as we go on and people get more reinfected, they start to have these health problems and they don't.
I mean, there does become a point, sadly not soon enough to help most of us, but there does become a point where class stops protecting you from a virus.
Well, that's the point of public health. I mean, that's why rich people used to care about it at all, right?
Exactly.
It was never really about taking care of poor people. It was the fact that if poor people have measles and mumps and rubella and they come into my house to do my laundry, I'm going to get measles, mumps, and rubella. So that is something
I'm not going to give up my servants.
Right. No, I mean, that was a major problem during the acute phase of the crisis when things were really closed, is that rich people were trying to like deal with the contradiction of wanting their servants to come in and do all their work for them, but also the servants being on public transit and having to live in homes with a bunch of other people and not having. So, they were doing things like testing their workers all the time. So there's only so much that an individual solution to a community problem can do. Exactly. And I just think a lot of these like podcaster kind of people, I say as I'm podcasting,
me too.
People who are, quite
the people who aren't asking for money like we are, or maybe I should say the people who are asking for money more often, more loudly, and more successfully, and putting their stuff behind paywalls.
Yeah. Regardless, there has been this like super, super, super successful othering of people who are harmed by COVID. And let me get into a little bit of what I mean by that. So when we first got vaccinated, we were told that we would be protected from, we actually were originally told we'd be protected from COVID. Then we were told we'd be protected from severe outcomes from COVID. And then when it became clear that that wasn't true, the media started to backstop Biden's failed plan to succeed over the virus by othering anybody who got hurt. So first they claimed it was unvaccinated people. That wasn't true. So the first Omicron wave that killed 200,000 people in 10 weeks or something insane, that wave, 40% of the people who died were vaccinated. But that was the wave where Biden went on TV and said, this is a pandemic of the unvaccinated. So that was a lie. And it's gotten worse since then. It's now the majority of people that die are vaccinated because these vaccines long term. They don't, it's not that they don't work, but they lose a lot of efficacy because the virus mutates so quickly. So
it's like last year's flu virus, basically, but on a faster scale. I mean, last year's flu vaccine, but on a faster scale. That's what I meant to say. Or because you need a new flu vaccine every year in order to keep up with the new variants of flu.
Well, and that's true of COVID too. And I don't think people realize it because they sort of purposely choose this minimizing language of it being a booster. We don't call a flu shot every year a booster flu shot. It's not. It's a different shot.
It's a flu shot, yes. It's a completely new shot for all the new stuff that's out there that people saw the previous year.
The XBB variant that was predominant last summer is the variant that's in the new shots. But of course, the original shots you had wouldn't have contained an XBB vaccine because it didn't exist yet. So people think that they're fully vaccinated. They're vaccinated for a virus that's genetically very different from the virus that's circulating right now.
Exactly.
But anyway, in terms of the construction of this outgroup, first it was unvaccinated people. When it became clear that wasn't true, they then expanded the outgroup to include vulnerable people, which can mean anything. You can really expand that word to mean anything, even on
And
a CDC phone
I know
website.
I mentioned this the last show, but comorbidities include, and these are the two big ones that people don't understand. One, people do not seem to understand that being over 40 is a comorbidity.
Yeah.
And the number two is, and this is the one that really seems to confuse people a lot, people do not have a medical understanding of the scientific meaning of the term morbidly obese. People hear the words morbidly obese and immediately think reality show, My 600-Pound Life, something extremely outside of the norm. Where in actuality, the medical definition of morbidly obese includes a range of people, has included a range of people from Roseanne Barr to Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Right.
Arnold Schwarzenegger had elective heart surgery in his 40s because he had heart problems related to morbid obesity, despite being the chairman of the President's Council on Physical Fitness. And this is simply because of the way that body weight works and body mass works. And cardiac health is important, whether the extra weight you're carrying is fat or muscle. And paying proper attention to cardiac health will do people more good than losing weight in most cases, because they need to exercise their heart. But people don't focus on each I'm losing myself in getting off topic. My original point is morbid obesity is a clinical term that covers a lot of things that we do not think of as medically morbidly obese.
Yeah.
Which is not to be fat phobic, but rather to understand the medical definition of morbid obesity is not tied to our mental image of fat people. That's my point.
Yeah. I mean, so the list of people who fall into this category of like medically vulnerable is like very broad and much more broad than people understand.
Exactly.
But along with that, the reality is the point of othering the people who are harmed by COVID is to communicate to every person that they're telling to risk COVID over and over and over again that you will not be harmed. That is the message.
They want you to feel safe. It's someone else.
And it's really the opposite of solidarity. It's what you do when you want to break solidarity. You say, but it's not going to happen to you. You know, and that's really been the focus of the media coverage since we moved away from this idea that, well, if you're vaccinated, you're not going to be harmed, because people who are vaccinated are still getting long COVID. Yes, it reduces your risk of long COVID, but not enough. Not enough if you're going to get it every single year. So the messaging has really been, if you got harmed, you're crazy. It didn't happen. And okay, maybe that happened to that person, but it's not going to happen to you. And that's exactly the kind of messaging I was talking about that Mark Veldhoen, the immunologist, does when he says, oh, well, show me a study that found long-term immune damage in patients that wasn't looking at long COVID patients. It's like, well, why would you not look at long COVID patients, AKA the people who are most harmed by COVID infections? You know, of course, you're not going to find the severe outcomes if you exclude the severe outcomes. So they just expect you not to think about it too hard.
This is what Trump said, though, and everybody laughed at Trump when he said it.
Right.
Which is this, well, if you just don't test, nobody's positive. If nobody's positive, there's no pandemic.
Yeah, no, that's really worked.
That's what everybody else has been doing ever since. But they laughed at Trump when he said it. It was so stupid, but they were fine doing it when they took power.
Yeah, the testing is atrocious, and even in hospitals, it's actually really bad as well. I mean, I just had a friend whose dad was hospitalized with pneumonia, and they refused to test him for COVID. And I don't think that's super uncommon. I mean, just there seems to be this really big push in medicine even to just like not talk about COVID. Like it's just
isn't most pneumonia secondary and opportunistic from something else?
Absolutely, yes. It could have been flu. COVID cases are higher than flu almost every point during the year, so it's most likely to be COVID. So I think they're also doing a little trick where they grouped together flu and pneumonia deaths. And those flu and pneumonia deaths were much higher than usual this year. And a lot of them were probably COVID. But that being said, I think that
I think RSV becomes something convenient to fold COVID deaths into as well.
Yeah, I mean, the testing really is atrocious. And the other thing I think people are not aware of is that even our home tests are less accurate than they used to be. So what you'll see a lot
viral mutation.
Yeah, what you'll see a lot on TikTok is like people saying, I've had this weird virus for like 3 weeks, but it's not COVID. I tested, and they've taken, a rapid test. And those rapid tests are very inaccurate up until day 4. I think by day 3, you've got like a 75% accuracy. By day 4, it's over 90%. So if you're past day 4 of symptoms, they're more accurate. You should do at least 2 tests, though, 2 days in a row. But that obviously that hasn't been communicated, and there's a reason for that. There's also a reason that when the administration did send out free tests, those are the tests they sent out, the inaccurate ones, even though there are more expensive tests that are highly, highly accurate, highly in agreement with a PCR test. I have some in my house. They cost lowest $25 a test. Some of them are $50 a test. There's one called a Lucira, which is like a flu and COVID test. There's one called Metrics, which it's $35 for a card reader, and then every test is $25. So it really adds up. Sorry?
Poor tax/disability tax strikes again.
Absolutely. I mean, and it's financially difficult for me to keep buying so many tests. And I actually think the reason that I got COVID in November was that I had a friend who was staying with me, and I tested him on the first day. But I remember when I went to my closet to get a test for him, I was like, should I use the rapid, which is like a couple bucks, or should I use one of the really good tests that's like $25-$30? And it was like, let's just use a rapid. And, then he got symptoms 2 days later. And I do regret not using the better test, but it's also like constantly this financial calculation for me of like, should I use one of the good ones? Do I need to? Is this person been highly exposed? And sometimes you make the wrong decision and you shouldn't have to. Like the test should just tell you.
This whole necessity of medical rationing for economic reasons is really a great way to do passive eugenics without actually rationing anything officially. There's a lot of rationing that's inherent in hospitals cutting the number of available beds and the number of ventilators on each hospital floor to cut costs. But they don't have to, but it's not addressed as a rationing issue. So no one ever raises questions about it because it's economics. And so it's just, well, don't cut the hospital beds. That's bad. But then of course the business does it because the business is always able to do what it wants.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now here's where I'm going to segue a little, because it's not just COVID. I'm going to go back in time a little bit to the George Floyd protests. The Associated Press ran a horrific article about protests here in Portland, where the only sources referenced were the official Portland police source by the Portland correspondent and the official Homeland Security source by Washington guy Jonathan Lemire, frequently appearing on MSNBC. So the only sources they talked to about a protest in Portland were a Portland police source who was not personally at the protest, but was just addressing the official police line, and a Homeland Security representative in Washington, D.C., who had no direct knowledge of anything going on at the protests at all. These were the only sources for the AP's official news coverage of George Floyd protests in Portland, Oregon. Yeah, not a single protester spoken to, not a single cop actually at the protest spoken to, not a single casual person on the street in the area of the protest spoken to, just the official cop spokesperson and the official Homeland Security spokesperson.
Yeah, of course. I mean, they let cops speak about anti-state
And
posts
and it's worse than it being the Guardian, because this is the Associated Press. Their story is what all the other newspapers are going to run as their own story.
Right. We see that over and over again. We see it with every topic.
Yes.
And it's all in support of the status quo. So climate change, whether it's Palestine, they cherry pick who gets to have an opinion and who gets to have a voice. In the case of this long COVID denier guy who was elevated, who, by the way, he's the chief medical officer of Queensland. I mean, I'm not like shit talking that job, but like usually the chief medical officer of Queensland, Australia, does not get like top billing and like headlines all over the world. Like that's not really usual.
And the story was just, and the story was just, and I'm not trying to be regionalist or sectionalist or elitist. I'm just saying usually the interview with the chief medical officer of Queensland by one of the 2 or 3 health writers for the Australian version of The Guardian doesn't get privileged international.
Right, and it's a state. I mean, it's like if, you know.
It would be like if it would be, well, the perfect example, because this is a guy with a similar history. Oh, for anybody who does not understand, the chief medical officer of Queensland, and here's where I really wish I knew Australian politics better, or maybe that my friend Kevin was in the audience today. But so this guy has a real frontline COVID doctors for patient rights or whatever they were feel to him, because his whole political identity that got him to his current position is that he was the first doctor in Australia to treat a COVID patient. It doesn't say whether that COVID patient lived or died or had a good or bad outcome. Just, you know, his claim to fame is that he was the first doctor in Australia to treat a COVID patient, which, you know, is apparently the basis for his expertise on COVID.
I think there's another thing that people really miss about using random doctors as resources. I'm not saying this about him, but I'm saying this about when you see Dr. So-and-so says XYZ. Doctors, like clinical practicing doctors that see patients, their expertise is not in research. So it's weird to interview a clinical practitioner about emerging research. Like it's almost like just interviewing a random dentist. Like let's say there was some like big new discovery about like, you know, the way that something happens with teeth, and then you just find a random dentist. It's like
the best example I can think of, because it used to be an everyday thing. He used to literally be on every morning until COVID, where suddenly as COVID went along, that somebody realized it's not a good idea to have somebody this obscure as your frontline expert. But the medical correspondent on Morning Joe for years was just Joe Scarborough's doctor in Florida.
That's funny.
And this was the guy who was being elevated to a national level as the official expert to talk about any medical news that was discussed on one of the 3 cable news networks' morning blah blah show.
Yeah. I mean, I guess exactly. I mean, the point is it's just it's a different skill set. It's also a different profession. I can give an example of something I found very funny, not funny, actually, not haha funny, but kind of scary funny at the beginning of the pandemic. This is just a good example of how just because you're a doctor doesn't mean you understand concepts like data and exponential growth. So the very, very, very beginning of the pandemic, when it was like just spreading in China, I was very concerned about it because of how many people were dying.
Yeah.
And people, minimizers, and at the time this included liberals, would post these things that were like, here's what my doctor says. Here's what my doctor says about this. It's like, your doctor doesn't know anything about epidemiology or what's happening in China. And what they would say is, my doctor says, oh, well, yeah, like a few thousand people have died of COVID. Do you know how many people die of the flu every year? And it's like, but but how many people have had COVID? Like you're comparing apples to oranges, and it just seemed like the doctors couldn't really conceptualize what the rate of death and the exponential growth of the virus meant for all of us, because that just wasn't how
the really scary thing that pops into my head is that every one of those doctors who goes on TV and denies COVID for a living is somebody's doctor.
Yeah. And in some cases, are celebrity doctors, and they like don't do anything anymore.
Well, I mean, there's one or two of those, but it's like one of the doctors who was being trotted out for a while to talk about this all the time was an AIDS doctor. And you would think if anybody, an AIDS doctor would be worried about the impact of COVID on people who are already immune deficient.
Do you know which doctor it was?
Oh, one of the ones who blocked me, which makes it hard to remember their name. She did some appearances. She was specifically being carried. She was specifically doing stuff with ABC as opposed to CNN or MSNBC. I remember that, but I can't remember her name. She blocked me the first time she noticed who I was.
Well, and so there's doctors, there's sort of like practitioners that are framed as experts on research that they haven't even read. And then there's also just people who aren't doctors at all. So there's Emily Oster, who was framed
as an economist. She works for, she's one of the sorts of people who was called in to give their opinion on when the Great Barrington.
She pushed.
She actually worked on the Great Barrington Declaration, I think.
Maybe I don't remember, but she certainly aligns with their.
She certainly pushes it for the code.
So she, she pushed very, very hard for school reopenings and argued all this stuff about how horrific it was for kids not to be in schools. She has no public health background. I mean, she wrote one book that she's quite famous for called Expecting Better, that was super trendy, and it, among other things, said that there's not enough evidence to like support fetal alcohol syndrome, and you should be able to drink a little bit when you're pregnant. And like, okay, like,
well, now there is, without wishing to get off topic or to be sidetracked, there is a wealth of interesting research about whether or not a very tiny amount of alcohol is good or bad.
Right.
That said, that specific research in no way validates known studies of fetal alcohol syndrome, which deal with much higher levels.
Well, and it's also sort of consistent with her to sort of argue against the precautionary principle. So for most people, this idea of like, well, we've got this new virus. We know that it damages blood vessels, invades the brain, maybe doing things to the immune system. We know that people are getting it repeatedly at a very high rate. Should we figure out more about that and try to prevent it? Or should we just give it to our kids over and over again and assume it's like probably fine? It's like, it's a very strange approach to something, even if you argue that it's ambiguous, whether the long-term outcomes are going to be absolutely catastrophic, which personally is what I believe. Even if you argue that you're not sure that's what's going to happen, it's weird to just like gamble the future of every child in America on like, maybe it'll work out.
You've written about the fallacy that the immune system is a set of muscles that needs to be worked out.
Don't get me started on this. Actually, do get me started on this. I will really go off on this. So the most important thing to understand about this claim, which is false, that your kids will be stronger and healthier if they get viruses, is that this claim comes from anti-vaxxers. It comes from anti-vaxxers. And it was mainstreamed by our mainstream media, by our liberal politicians, by everyone in power, just in order to continue to normalize constant COVID reinfections. So they threw science under the bus. They threw centuries of work of public health, of getting people to understand avoiding illness and ways to avoid illness and why that's important. They threw all that under the bus just to normalize COVID. And it's also why we're going to see worse and worse outbreaks of things like measles, because parents were told, and they believe it, including liberal parents, that if your kid gets sick, that's going to make them healthier in the long term. That is not true. That is 100% false. The thing that misinformation is sort of spun out of is something called the hygiene hypothesis, which is itself controversial. But the hygiene hypothesis says that your body needs good bacterias to
Yes.
build up a good immune response. And a good bacteria, because people are just so scientifically illiterate, a good bacteria has nothing to do with a pathogenic microbe like a virus. They're completely different. So the hygiene hypothesis is the origin of those people who say, oh, let your kid play in the dirt. They need to get bacteria. That's fine. That's completely different than giving them viral illnesses that harm their blood vessels, organs, and brains.
A good bacteria means a yogurt culture, people.
Yes. It is completely separate from things like measles, mumps, rubella,
and
HIV, HPV, COVID.
And I will add, simply because I want to make sure that my awareness is out there too. If you have the wrong immune disorder, you should probably avoid yogurt.
Yes, I mean, I want to go down the immunity debt road just a little bit further, because I actually wrote about it in late 2022. So that is the point at which immunity debt became a really, really common, and that's how long they've been claiming that your kid's illness is from lockdown, by the way. So in late 2022, they were saying, oh, your kid's getting sick all the time. Oh, no, that's not because of the new virus that we keep giving them over and over again that may cause immune damage. That's because they did lockdown. There's so many issues with this, but let me start with the first thing, which is that most of your motherfucking kids did not even do lockdown. Let me start with that. But secondly, for those kids who did do lockdown, mostly a matter of months, and it was 4 years ago. And a lot of these kids that are super sick were not even born yet in 2020. They were not born.
And I know that your more recent article about this references these numbers, but I'm just going to throw them out there anyway for people who haven't read it. Why, if this is true, then why is there more immunity debt in the US and Sweden than China?
Right. Well, I mean, China is also starting to get,
but China had lockdown, had more real lockdowns and for much longer than the US or Sweden.
Sweden shouldn't have any long-term illness issues.
Exactly.
To this logic, because they never locked down.
Exactly. And China should have the most. And yet that's not how it works. In fact, the first time I heard of the immunity debt theory was when the Eurasian Institute got a hold of it. And mainstream liberal foreign policy thinkers who knew nothing about COVID were talking about how immunity debt was a legitimate reason for China to end their zero COVID policies for the sake of the U.S. supply chain.
Right.
That they were pressuring China to save them from immunity debt.
What's really interesting is if you go back to 2020, before any of this happened, and it was all Trump and the far right-wing people and MAGA saying you can't shut things down, this was a right-wing argument against the shutdown. It was, oh, well, if you wear masks, that's going to destroy your immune system. And all these same mainstream outlets that are now pushing this idea that your kid's immune system got harmed by wearing masks, they debunked it in writing. The New York Times debunked it. They were like, no, wearing a mask can't hurt your immune system. That's not true. That's anti-vaxxer bullshit. Now they're pushing it. And they would rather throw science under the bus and your kids under the metaphorical bus than actually confront that these kids are getting sicker and sicker and sicker. And by the way, sorry, let me just say also that the kids getting sicker and sicker and sicker is not just something that you anecdotally will notice, which you will anecdotally notice. Parents will tell you their kids are sick as shit. But even beyond that, the statistics show kids are sicker and sicker and sicker. There are more sick days for kids every year. And in the UK, they are actually implementing all of this really harsh, they're trying to implement all these harsh rules to make sick kids go to school, as if that is going to solve the problem. I mean, this level of COVID denial is so beyond. It's like they force the kids back into unsafe school. The kids have compromised immune systems. The kids are sick all the fucking time. And seeing this record high absence because of illness, they come out and they say, hey, we've got a new policy. If your kid is sick, make sure you force them to go to school. This is abusive.
I have a theory about this.
Yeah.
And this theory is that the public health and the germ theory of illness, as proven, and infection protocols and the germ theory of illness, as established by Semmelweis and proven since, have always been more controversial than we have believed them to be. That there have been forces at work who have been reading Thomas Malthus since he wrote his stuff in the Victorian era, who really believe that they should keep poor people dirty and sick for their own good. And by their own good, they mean their own good, not the good of the poor people. And that these people have been pushing back against every idea of public health because they want poor people to die. And that this group includes people who justify themselves using the most ruthless Nazi eugenics in the guise of social Darwinism, and people who use the most religious predestinarian arguments for why good people won't get sick. And that these people have successfully used the COVID emergency to roll back everything they don't like since Ignaz Semmelweis.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's always been a eugenicist undermining of public health for that reason. And also sort of what you mentioned, that they have, it's this very ableist idea, right? It's this idea, it's like a meritocracy for health, right?
Yes.
It's like, well, if you're good and you do the good things, you're not going to get sick. And I see this logic, not just on the right, but on the left now as well, where people say, well, I work out and I eat my vitamins and I eat well, and that's why I'm not
like there's a moral
get disabled. And it's not true. And that's just not how health works. It's not how viruses work. It's not how luck and the way things go works,
even beyond that, though, it's this belief that the things they do show they are a good person. Mm-hmm. And because they are a good person, they will have good outcomes.
Well, it's very capitalist thinking. It's this idea.
It ends up being that. Yes.
I'm going to get what I deserve. And I don't think people understand, especially people on the left, don't understand to what degree they've internalized that, right? Like, they think of themselves as anti-capitalist, but at the same time, they're like, as an individual, because I'm doing the right things are going to happen to me. And that's not how
the American moral lens. The idea of what's good and what's bad is depressingly reactionary. And we have to understand that right away, that our moral culture as a society was created by people who, on the one hand, were religious extremists trying to create a religious utopia, which anyone who did not share their religious beliefs would see as a dystopia. And on top of that, they were trying to make money for capitalists who had invested in them. And if you combine that and you look at our moral culture as a whole, it makes sense. It's part of this same historical continuity. And that's a lot to work against. And you have to really inform yourself about some of these cultural biases to overcome them. And it's hard. It's really hard to be conscious of some of this stuff when you're bombarded by all the propaganda and quote unquote experts.
And the propaganda can be really subtle. So I actually want to discuss one other piece of media that I wrote about. And let me also plug my Substack, The Gauntlet, that I wrote about on The Gauntlet. It's at thegauntlet.news. Please subscribe if you can afford it. My stuff isn't paywalled, so subscribe if you can afford it to be nice, but also you can read it either way.
But people like Julia and myself, and I'm sorry for getting on the soapbox here, we're really trying to do a lot of the work that the media is failing to do, both because of the propaganda we're talking about and because of the layoffs of journalists. And we're really trying hard to bring information to you that you wouldn't get if we weren't working on it, or that you would be less likely to get if we weren't working on it. And it would really help us do this if you can afford it, if you could pay us for our work.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Anyway, so there's this piece that I wrote a couple weeks back in response to an NPR piece that went quite viral on sort of disabled Twitter and COVID-aware Twitter. I think this piece is a really good example of the subtle ways in which seemingly innocuous articles can be heavily, heavily propagandist. So this article was written by a woman, and it was expressing her frustration that her husband, who had COVID, he had a severe case of COVID, he developed long COVID, and now years later, they're constantly having to negotiate, which she refers to as her husband's fear of COVID and his anxiety about getting COVID. And she frames it as, this is like his anxiety is a problem in our marriage. We go to a therapist who is like helping him to like get over his anxiety about COVID. And, she masks in public spaces, but she thinks there should be a compromise where sometimes he eats inside restaurants, does indoor dining without a mask, even though
remember this,
he knows that he could become permanently disabled, more disabled, or die from this. So what's interesting to me about publishing this, which is presented as a sort of like little opinion piece, a little slice of life, there is this whole giant below the surface piece of this iceberg that isn't discussed in the piece, which is just accepting that the new normal is that disabled people are going to have to pick. Do they want to be part of back to normal life and risk their health? Or do they want to live in fear and anxiety? And those are the only two options. There's no third option that is, shouldn't we confront that there is a massive civil rights issue where disabled people are no longer safe in any public space? That is not at issue in this piece. That is accepted. And NPR puts it to you that is accepted. That's fine. Disabled people won't be safe in public, and you just have to deal with your anxiety about that as a disabled person.
This goes back to a basic attitude in our culture that disabled people don't really deserve accommodation.
Correct.
I've been reading, I always hate to talk about Twitter dialogue on the show, but this discourse continually comes up.
Yeah.
It continually ends up being adopted by the worst faith, most Nazi trolls in the replies, defending the quote unquote serious leftists making these comments. But you repeatedly see a Twitter discourse on the so-called left about DoorDash, in which disabled people are blamed for DoorDash instead of the corporate interests behind DoorDash. And that complaining about the need for something like DoorDash for people who are unable to drive because of their disability, which I bring up because I do not appear to be physically disabled to 90% of the people who meet me, because I present in every way as an able-bodied man. However, I was epileptic when I was a kid, and the epilepsy came back in my 30s, which means I can't drive. Now, I want to say that even above and beyond having the sort of disability that might leave one housebound at times, not being able to drive in American society is in itself a very serious disability because of our car culture and our poverty of both public transportation and good accommodations for disabled people in public transportation. Now, you combine that with the difficulty that disabled people would have managing all their groceries on public transportation, even with the best accommodations, and you come up with a need for some sort of service like DoorDash for the most disabled people, and then you come to the realization that if you make it only for the most disabled people, you are creating a system of means testing and medical testing that inevitably will drive people who need the assistance from even seeking it because they are intimidated and stigmatized by the testing, which will then mean people who need help won't get help, which means you actually need a service like DoorDash everybody can use, but you need it to somehow be sustainable and local.
Yeah. I have so many thoughts about this. I think one of the
But we avoid that whole conversation about this real need for a different way to organize our society by saying DoorDash is bad. It's bad to order DoorDash. Disabled people who talk about their need to order from DoorDash are ridiculously privileged and should shut up.
Yeah, I think a lot of the discourse comes from people just not knowing what disability is, not knowing what it looks like, not knowing how disabled people are living, all of this stuff. Let me unpack a few things in there. So firstly, often when able-bodied people start this discourse, the way that it starts is somebody who's able-bodied says, I can't believe people use delivery services. It's so lazy and there's no reason to ever use it. That's usually the way the discourse starts.
This totally exclusivist eliminationist stand. Exactly.
And then the response gets framed as, oh, these people are so ridiculous. They're saying that they can't survive without these horrible services. And it's like, well, first of all, a lot of this, like you said, is in really bad faith. So apparently what they hear when disabled people say, well, I use delivery services and it's not because I'm lazy, it's because like some days I physically can't leave my house or yada, yada, yada. What they hear is, I like that DoorDash is exploitive and I think that workers should be exploited, which was never said by any disabled person. So let's start there.
So this is the pancakes and waffles conversation.
Moving on, though, they also have this idea. One, there seem to be these two really strange ideas among able-bodied people. The first is that no disabled person could ever not function well enough to like make a meal or make microwave food or do XYZ instead of ordering.
I will mention this because I see it a lot, the internalized ableism of disabled people who say, I do this, and so every other disabled person should be able to do it. So
one is like painting with a broad brush in that way. But then also on the other side, the thing they say a lot is it's so privileged to be able to use DoorDash, so there's no way that a real, quote unquote, real disabled person could afford it. So according in their mind, a real disabled person is someone who's totally functional, but also has $0. Because I want to be clear, this idea that no one who's disabled could ever afford DoorDash. I mean, some people who are disabled have jobs. A lot of people who are disabled, in fact, have full-time jobs. And DoorDash costs like $20. Like I'm not saying every single person can spend $20 from time to time, but also they seem to assume when people say I rely on DoorDash a lot, they think to themselves, well, they must be ordering DoorDash for every meal then, and that means they're spending $60 a day. That's not what disabled people are saying. They're saying that like, I mean, some of them might be, I don't know, but I'm saying that like for many disabled people, what they're saying is that during weeks where I'm in a crash and I can't leave my house and I'm housebound or I'm bedbound, I might survive on cereal and Cliff Bars and a bunch of junk. And then one day out of the week, I order like a real nice meal so that I can have some protein.
Let's go with me not driving.
Yeah.
Because this is important. This is important to understand, and I'm belaboring this because the service for an otherwise able-bodied man who does not drive to get any sort of help with this sort of thing doesn't exist.
Yeah. Well, that's another thing is that they really imagine this like very developed. I don't know why, because if you're on the left, you obviously know that this country treats vulnerable people like absolute shit.
Yes, and I don't know where these assumptions.
But there's this idea that there's like this government program, and
I know where the idea comes from, but it's evidence of their shallow thinking.
Well, and also their incuriosity, their lack of curiosity about disabled people. Let me just say something also about long COVID, because you mentioned like they need to use these services and to have diagnoses. It's like we were just spending the first half of this discussion talking about how long COVID is really unacknowledged, how it's being buried, how it's being stigmatized, how doctors don't know how to diagnose this. And long COVID, one of the big presentations of it is, of course, this severe fatigue and exhaustion, going into crashes, not being able to do anything. And doctors have people around the country who really have these symptoms and have no diagnosis. So that's a great example of people who couldn't be using such services, even if they did exist, which mostly they do.
And doctors have a tendency to dismiss people who say they are tired as malingering rather than sick.
Absolutely.
And it's worse if they're women or Black.
Yes. And Oh, there was one other thing I wanted to say about this sort of use of these expensive services. The other thing I wanted to mention was, well, first of all, a bunch of disabled people were pointing out, like, yes, this is also a tax on us, you know, like we have to pay these like very high fees. And one of the ways people afford it is they're not doing other stuff, you know, like, I'm sorry, but like, I really don't believe a lot of these leftists that are like, no disabled person could ever afford to get a meal delivered, didn't spend $20 on like a drink this week, didn't go out to a restaurant. No, what's very weird is the like fixation on this as like the one type of exploitive service that they don't use is like somehow more evil than all the exploitive services that they do. And they don't even have like the any sort of like reason to do it.
If you really think about it, the person who is the person who is making this judgment of what it means to be a real disabled person, or making this judgment on what it means to be a real working person, while at the same time telling on themselves by saying how they always have the time and energy and resources to cook, no matter what. That shows a certain amount of privilege to me.
Yeah, I did also want to contrast this discourse with something I read yesterday, because I thought it was really interesting and really telling about how like disabled people really can't win. So you were talking about car culture. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a really tragic accident in San Francisco. And I believe what I read was that the individual who was driving this car, who crashed into pedestrians and killed a couple of them, including a small child, this was like an 80-year-old woman. And all the comments were like, why was this woman driving? And there were a couple comments where people said, if you're that age, you should be taking Uber. So in contrast to a week of people saying disabled people shouldn't be using these exploitive service, an actual disabled person tried to function without using an exploitive service, killed people, and then people still wanted to blame them and say, well, why wasn't she taking Uber? So it's like...
Well, my favorite factoid, which means it may or may not be true, as opposed to the all too often use of factoid as a fun fact, which is a different thing. But my favorite factoid, something widely believed that may or may not be true about Ray Charles, is that when he was a young man, he was supposedly frequently arrested for driving, despite being blind.
Wow.
Now, if you understand that the young Ray Charles was a poor black man who could not afford someone to drive for him in an era where the only way to have someone drive for you was to pay them to drive for you, then you understand why Ray Charles kept getting arrested for trying to drive.
Yeah, I think it's really people... It's a no-win scenario, really, for disabled people trying to survive. And I want to say a couple more things about people on the left discussing ableism. One is, if I go to your page and I search for the word ableism, and the only time you've used it during a four-year-long pandemic during which disabled people have been killed by state negligence every single day for 4 years, the only time you've used it is to mock disabled people. Don't give your 2 cents. You need to do some reading. You need to do some learning. You need to shut the fuck up, honestly. And
there was something that somebody said, and they were trying to be dismissive and mocking, but we're actually proving the logic of systemic issues, which is they want us to believe everything is ableism. Well, I mean, everything is capitalism.
Well, what does that sound like? Oh, they're always making everything about race.
Yes, or they're always making
about race. Why are you always making everything about gender? It's not about
these communists always going on about capitalism.
Right. All of this stuff is interconnected, and you sound ridiculous, and you sound ignorant.
It's like if everything is ableist in the same way that everything is racist, and everything is sexist, and everything is queerphobic, and everything is capitalist. They're all part of interlocking systems that protect a hierarchy that consists of mostly straight white men.
Yeah. And I want to say one other thing about the delivery discourse, which I really don't like getting involved in, and I wish it would just fucking go away. But like, the last thing I'll say about it is that it's quite ironic because I've seen so many leftists arguing with me for the last couple of years when I try to explain what's happening with COVID, with long COVID, how disabled people are not safe in public spaces, how, I haven't been able to indoor dine for several years and I don't plan to. And, they've argued back with me and said, it's for my mental health. I have to eat in the indoor, not even on the patio, because honestly, like I eat on the patio sometimes, much, much safer. I have to eat in the indoor part of the restaurant for my mental health or I can't survive. Now that is an example of actually, that's not a need. That's just, I don't care about other people and I'm going to do whatever the fuck I want. And so if you're going to come at me with that energy for years and years on end of how you have to eat in the indoor part of the restaurant and you don't care if people get disabled from it, don't fucking talk about other people getting delivery because they're not even safe in restaurants right now. Like you think that disabled people don't deserve a restaurant meal? I mean, they can't go in there because of you motherfuckers that don't.
And then there's somebody, and I know they were doing this. I know they were doing this to make DoorDash look bad, but that's not how the Walmart PR department would see it if they ever got a hold of the tweet chain. But somebody actually made this post talking about how DoorDash drivers would be so much better if they just got a job at Walmart for $13 an hour. And it's like, first, that Walmart doesn't pay $13 an hour everywhere, even though they might like you to believe they do. Second, ask any disabled person who's worked at Walmart how Walmart treats the disabled employees it uses as props.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so many of these services, of these businesses that we all patronize on a day-to-day basis are horrific and exploitive. And I don't think any disabled person would be against, especially because disabled people do work for DoorDash. Like, yes, like disabled people do all sorts of things. And even like, it just seems like in the eyes of people who, again, haven't said the word ableist in a 4-year-long mass murder of disabled people. It seems like their concept of a disabled person is, one, they look disabled. I can see them on the street and I know they're disabled. 2, they can do anything they set their minds to. It's this sort of like toxic, weird, they're not disabled, they're different.
The handy-capableism.
They can do anything I can do.
The handy-capableism argument that disabled people are superheroes who can overcome their disability.
And 3, they have access to all kinds of services that they need, but at the same time, they're also so impoverished that they never have $20. So like all of this just sounds super ignorant. And like, I'm sorry, but like at some point, you need to listen. Like if just like hundreds of people from a marginalized group come into your comment and say like, this is racist, you shouldn't double down and be like, no, it's not, I'm right.
On the other hand, it sort of makes sense in a culture where the only disabled people you ever see are celebrities, people of the relatively well-off class, and Paralympians.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I also just think people don't know what disability said. It's like,
but there's propaganda around that too. If we want to go back to that, there's propaganda about what disability is, and there is insidious internalized ableism in which the most disabled people are used to make the least disabled people feel guilty about asking for accommodations. Or worse, the most disabled people become friends with less disabled people in order to help the less disabled people understand that their disability isn't really that bad. Some people have it worse than.
Yeah, I mean, capitalism, like the same way that they will use certain women or certain Black people or any kind of, certain trans people that they invite to the White House and they say like, this person likes us, so that must mean we're good on gay rights or we're good on women's rights or whatever. They do this with disabled people as well. So there was a big backlash at one point where they had some sort of event with some sort of, leaders of some disability organization. There was no masking, and some of the people apologized, but some of the people were like, it's, I just have to live my life. And it's that's just how power works, right? Like it's always going to find people that agree with what it's doing and then elevate those people. And this is, again, it actually returns really nicely to the topic that we started on, which is how does propaganda function? So finding those disabled people who are willing to say, oh, I can't let COVID run my life, so I'm just going to risk dying every time I leave the house, and I'm happy about it. That's that helps the whole system go down easier.
One of my difficulties is that my wife is, on the one hand, more vulnerable than me, but on the other hand, less cautious. And so I have to deal with the argument, well, if I'm willing to do it, you should be too.
Right. That's not uncommon, I would say. I mean, I think we also have to keep in mind that everyone is vulnerable to propaganda. So far in 2024, we've had over 20,000 deaths from COVID in the last couple of months. That's a lot of people, many of them disabled. And those people that died, most of them, I would say probably all of them, did not think they were going to die of COVID. They were like, that's not going to happen to me.
I'm sure that nobody who died of COVID thought they were going to die of COVID.
Precisely. But I mean, this, again, like this is why the messaging is so powerful, because it always tells you that you're special and you're the exception and you're the main character and nothing bad's going to happen to you. You hear this a lot with the way long COVID patients talk about, well, a lot of them, to be fair, many people didn't even know what long COVID was before they got long COVID. But some of them say, yes, I had heard of long COVID, but I just didn't think it could happen to me because I'm so fit and I ran marathons and I did XYZ and I took my vitamins. Mm-hmm. That's really common. And I think it's really important for us to, kill the ableist in our head that says, like, there's something about me that means that I can't be disabled. Disabled people are a separate group from me, and I don't have to have solidarity.
I hate to give a capitalist television commercial credit, but one of the best statements about this health cult that I've ever seen was in a TV commercial for the shingles vaccine, where people are going on about all the things they do to keep themselves healthy, and this impressive narrator voice just keeps saying, "Shingles doesn't care."
Yeah, shingles does not care.
And there are things worse than shingles, and they also don't care.
They don't care. And I think it's actually kind of instructive that you mentioned shingles. I mean, shingles
is a post-viral syndrome of chickenpox.
Right. And it's more common now after COVID because COVID is reactivating pathogens. So it's actually important if you can. I mean, shingles vaccine is only recommended for older people, but if you're able to get someone to give it to you, it'd be good to get a shingles vaccine. That being said, I just think it's really interesting to think about the contrast between decades of public health messaging that's like avoid illness, gets vaccinated, and now the new public health messaging of get COVID, it's better in the long run. Get your kids sick, it's better in the long run. Don't put your kids in masks, it's going to hurt them. All of this, again, it's anti-vaxxer shit.
I will point out, and I know anecdotal evidence, blah, 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 but yes, the shingles vaccine is specifically recommended for people over 50. However, the only person I know personally who has shingles is the nice young lady next door in her 30s who's basically my wife's adopted surrogate daughter. So it's not just the people who are advised for the vaccine who can get shingles.
Shingles is becoming more common in younger people because of COVID. And we know this, and it's not being communicated to people.
And she and her husband did have COVID, so that makes sense.
You will see that. You will see also this rise in tuberculosis. So tuberculosis is also can be inactive.
Yes.
People can have the pathogen and it's getting activated by COVID. And we also see this in HIV patients. So there are a lot of things that people who were warning that COVID was harming the immune system said we could expect. And then also minimizers said wouldn't happen. So some of those people I was talking about, like Francois Balou, I think was the one who said, well, if COVID was damaging the immune system, we'd be seeing more TB, we'd be seeing more fungal infections. We're seeing all of those things. So that's very concerning, even according to the biggest minimizer who claims it's not happening by his own admission. If we're seeing this spike in fungal infections, deadly fungal infections, a spike in sepsis, a spike in TB, a spike in viral infections, it seems like there's something else going on. And I think we're also going to see that with this return of measles. So I really want to...
This raises a question I know you may not know an actual answer, but I'm sure you've wondered about this too. How many of our doctors these days actually believe in the germ theory of illness and not some weird miasma theory?
I think they believe in germs. I just think that some of them, many of them, in order to accommodate watching everyone around them, including their own children, getting COVID over and over again, have adopted the anti-vaxxer view that getting sick is good for you. And that's very bad. That's not good for medical doctors to believe that. But let me just say something about measles. So measles, there's two reasons that we're seeing it start to spread more widely. The first, of course, anti-vaxxers. There are more and more anti-vaxxers. And a lot of that has to do also with not explaining the long-term effects of COVID. So the fact that the administration has left everyone out to dry in terms of long-term post-COVID effects, which include heart attacks, which include strokes, which include diabetes, which include autoimmune diseases, which include Alzheimer's, which include depression of the immune system. Everyone's observing those things and they don't have any official explanation for them. So they're turning to anti-vaxxers.
And there's some very interesting research that suggests that the measles vaccine actually wears off eventually. And it's only the fact that enough people are vaccinated as young people that keeps us from being exposed to the measles after it's worn off.
A few things. If you have a doctor, which not everyone does, but if you do, or if you can go to a doctor, you can ask for antibody titers. Ask your doctor for antibody titers and ensure that you are still have good immune protection against measles, mumps, rubella. And if you don't, they can give you a booster. That booster is a live vaccine, however, so you should also take a look at your immune system and make sure that it's still functioning well after COVID. That's called a lymphocyte subset panel. So those are two things you should do. That being said, though, what I was going to say about measles spreading, a rise of anti-vaxxers, but there's also just a depressed immunity across the community. So the way the wall of herd immunity works, it's like a vaccine's not perfect. Like it protects you 90% of the time if you have a strong immune system. But some of these kids, people don't realize that they're now immunocompromised or now their immune system's not functioning well. So they're not going to mount a really good response to being exposed to measles. So for that reason, like it's all of these parents who think they're so superior to anti-vaxxers and they're so protected from measles. The thing that protected you was herd immunity. And that's breaking down. That wall of herd immunity is breaking down both because of anti-vaxxers and because of anti-maskers, of which you are one, and your own kids and your own family will not be well protected if measles continues to circulate like this. So take it seriously. And, we've not talked about it in this call, but I think we did in the last call. The most important thing is clean indoor air.
Yes.
So the improvement of ventilation filtration, join us in organizing for that, because if you don't want your kid to be sick every other week, it's really important. And in the meantime, I always mask in indoor spaces. It's a really, really, really helpful tool. And if you don't want to do it, to me, it's just not that different from being an anti-vaxxer at this point. It's not that different. I mean, you're so worried about measles spreading. You're so mad at anti-vaxxers parents. But if there were masks and clean air, those anti-vaxxers wouldn't even be your problem.
It's all the same. It's all these same misconceptions about vaccines, whichever side of the vaccine debate you're on, that good vaccines are perfect.
Yeah.
And that once vaccines are good enough, no one will ever get sick again. And
we need layered mitigation. We need different layers of mitigation. So clean indoor air is like the minimum of what we need. And
masking is how every individual can help contribute. Masking is how every individual can contribute to collectively clean indoor air.
Yeah, as much as possible. I mean, personally, I always do it. I think it's definitely harder if you have younger kids. And I think talking to the other parents about clean indoor air and figuring out how best to, protect the kids in like a daycare setting It's just really critical. Like these schools shouldn't have reopened without upgraded ventilation and filtration, but they did. Unless you're Sheesh, John, Rochelle, Walensky, who send their kids to a school that did upgrade its ventilation and filtration. And they don't tell you that. They just tell you send your kids back to your school that didn't get that super special treatment.
Yes. And or worse, and I bring this up because it's something that has really happened in our wonderful country. You go to the effort of lying about where you live to get your kid into a school with that air filtration system, and they send you to prison for 10 years.
Yeah, the carceral state is moving into sort of enforcement of forced infection for sure.
But I take that example because that's a pre-COVID example.
Yeah.
That is a pre-COVID example where someone who wanted to get her kid into a better school was hit with massive carceral penalties for lying about her address to get her black kid into the mostly white school.
So this also ties into what I was talking about with the harsh punishments for student absences. So instead of acknowledging like, hey, the kids are much more sick and they're out of school much more often because they are so sick, and we should as adults do something to protect them, this response, this authoritarian and carceral response has been the sicker kids get, the more penalties, the more that they should be punished, the more that their parents should be punished. So, you do have cases in the US of parents going to jail because of the absence of their kids. And we're seeing, like I said, these kids some of them are just getting sick all the time because their immune system is fucked up. Some of them have long COVID. There are a lot of kids with long COVID and they can't go to school every day. And their parents are being punished for this as if it's something that they're doing wrong. So again, we really see how the state conspires to try to force productivity out of sick and disabled people, blames you for your inability to be productive, whether you're a kid or whether you're an adult in a workplace. This is all going to come back to no matter how you're harmed, no matter how you're hurt, you need to be clocking in, you need to be clocking out, you need to be working. And if you're not, we're going to stigmatize you and we're going to say you're lying and we're going to get everyone to turn against you and hate you, even if they're on the left. So like that is the danger of what you're all buying into, this whole villainization of long COVID patients. This is what it is. It's a tool to break your solidarity. It's a tool to ensure that you don't fight for any protections, that you don't fight for any right to health. And you're really not only throwing your comrades under the bus, you're throwing yourself under the bus because you are getting COVID over and over again. You are getting these impacts on your organs, on your blood vessels, on your brain that you either don't know about or you're not even connecting to those repeated COVID infections, those repeated viral infections.
It's the sort of thing where if you can see the places where you're taking the risks and then you can compare when you're taking the risks to where you're getting sick, you're gonna see an overlap.
Yeah, I mean, I think it can be really hard for people because again, there's been this lack of communication, very purposeful lack of communication about like COVID is airborne. That means you need a certain kind of mask, not a surgical mask, but a KN95 or an N95. Mm-hmm. COVID is, and the reason they don't communicate about that is because COVID can hang in rooms and a KN95, the other person doesn't work to prevent COVID.
And a KN95 isn't quite as good as an N95, and N95 is better if available. Yeah, a KN95 is the acceptable minimum.
Right. Anything with a head strap is better. A seal, though, is what you really need. So that's misinformation. But there's also the misinformation of just omission. So again, like I was saying, not explaining to people that COVID is causing heart attacks is causing more people to become anti-vaxxers. There's a lot of negative downstream outcomes of hiding things from the public. But another thing is just like, COVID is causing autoimmune disorders. I see people like on lefty Twitter all the time being like, oh my gosh, I got this new autoimmune disorder. They don't mask. They haven't talked about COVID in years. They think it's crazy to still care about COVID. And that means they're going around unmasked now, which means that most likely their autoimmune condition is going to worsen. It's going to become less controllable. And they don't know that. And that's really sad to see.
And then this raises another question. Maybe it wasn't new. I mean, because everybody who has an autoimmune disorder has most people who have an autoimmune disorder have some point in their life at which they didn't know they had an autoimmune disorder.
Yeah, and COVID can both like worsen underlying conditions,
Yeah.
which is what I saw after my own infection. So I have something called POTS, which causes me to like be faint when I stand up. It doesn't affect my life too much, but it got a lot worse after COVID, and it's actually improved since then. So, but I did start to have these like racing heart after eating, which was really frustrating. But I knew enough to associate that back to COVID. Most people do not. Another one is, strokes. Like I've just seen young people having strokes and having heart attacks, dropping dead, or being severely ill. And then in the next, during their recovery, they're still not wearing masks.
And this is where, and I'm belaboring this point, I know. This is where the medical scientific diagnosis of morbidly obese versus the public perception of a fat person comes into play. A surprising number of people who fall into what would be considered medically morbidly obese are athletes in sports where you build muscle mass.
Yeah.
And it is suspicious to see them suddenly dropping dead of heart attacks in something that we know it when we know there's something out there that attacks the heart. And people who are morbidly obese by the medical definition are more at risk.
Yeah, and there's a couple other risk factors they have as well. So because they're young and quote unquote healthy, they most likely didn't get a drug like Paxlovid, which can reduce post-COVID health outcomes. But also additionally, one of the most important things you can do to help your body recover from COVID is to have a significant amount of rest. And again, this is why we see this really, really divergent. One of the reasons we see these really divergent outcomes in how much long COVID you see in someone who makes $25,000 versus how much long COVID you see when someone makes $200,000, which I just saw some stats that basically said it was like, 15% among people making $200,000 or more, but more like 40% for people making $25,000 or less. Rest is really, really important to help your body recover from COVID. And so I think what's happening with a lot of athletes is that their job is working out and being athletic, and they're forcing themselves to work out through their infection while their heart is under a lot of strain. They're forcing themselves to go back too quickly.
There is a culture.
All of that are significant risk factors.
There's a culture in sports of, to the best of your ability, fighting through illness and injury in order to perform.
Right. Working out when you have the flu, working out when no matter how you're feeling, that's their job. So this
culture leads to intensely ableist attitudes if athletes become disabled that can have horrible consequences for their lives.
Yeah. And I think it also ties back to just like the fetishization of productivity under capitalism generally. So I think as leftists, we do start to recognize that attitude of like, you got to give every hour to your employer. You're a badass if you work 80 hours a week. You're so cool. You're so good. You're XYZ. And we do try.
Now, what's interesting is that is not unique to capitalism. There was a period called the heroic labor era in the Stalinist Soviet Union, where these huge, impossible productivity marks met by these super workers were glorified. People were named heroes of Soviet labor for their great productivity.
Yeah.
And this idea that the individual worker should strive to be a superhero,
right,
was lionized under the most communist system of the time. It's not unique to capitalism, and we have to be on the lookout for it.
Yeah, I think we see that also sometimes in leftist spaces, just I give everything to the cause and I don't even need to get paid and I do XYZ. And so I do think we all could sort of
hey, there's a reason our stuff isn't paywalled, right? I mean, we want people to be able to see our stuff no matter whether they're able to pay us for it or not.
Surely.
Which is good because it means more people can consume that content, but it also means it's more difficult for us to get paid for our labor.
Yeah.
because we're already giving the milk away for free, so to speak.
Yeah, I did start paywalling some personal essays to try to encourage more people to pay, but I don't paywall anything that is critical public health information, which is most of the stuff that I write.
It's really, there was a little while where I was putting up temporary paywalls for things on my Patreon that wore off after so much time.
Mm-hmm.
And when I do something, I do occasionally post stuff just for patrons about community stuff in general and attempts to build some sort of camaraderie. But I don't believe in paywalls. I really have a committed opposition to paywalls that makes me very reluctant to paywall my own stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I'm trying to walk a line, but like I said, like anything that's like public health information, the personal essays don't include any links to anything like studies, anything like that. It's just like my own thoughts. But that being said, I understand that. And I honestly feel, especially in this era of COVID, I feel like every minute that I'm awake, I'm in some way working. Like you might feel like, oh, well, like being on the internet isn't working. But, you know, I just started an Instagram actually at Gauntlet News. And I'm starting to repost my old articles on there. And part of running that Instagram is I'm also following all the mask blocks and all of the radical organizers around the country who are doing all this work. I'm sharing art, I'm sharing events, I'm sharing information, and I'm sort of organizing them all into story highlights. And I'm kind of just doing that whenever I have a free minute. So it's like, it does sort of start to take over your life because it just feels so urgent. And you just keep feeling like, well, maybe if I do one more thing today, like it's gonna make a difference. And I will say that I think we've seen a lot of progress on the left about COVID. I don't want to be like all gloom and doom. Like, yes, there are some like big podcasters that don't care about COVID, but I think unfortunately it's become one of those things where it's like the top of the Democratic Party is totally detached from what most Democrats want. I think that the bottom-up organizing we're seeing about COVID, although it's not being represented in big leftist media, it really is there. Of course, it's there. You know, if you go to Gauntlet News, my Instagram, you will see me resharing information from mask blocks in every city in the US and all over the world. They're doing the most fantastic, the coolest stuff. They're even really prioritizing, you know, so many people say, well, we have to live our life. We have to be able to socialize. They're really prioritizing the joy, the community, the camaraderie by hosting COVID safe events and doing that work of getting air filters and getting purifiers and gathering people in masks and learning how to navigate this new normal and figuring out, like, for real, how do we live with COVID? How do we live with COVID and still invite our disabled and vulnerable comrades into this space?
I hate to give another capitalist marketing gimmick credit, but do you remember when Oscar Mayer did that thing where everybody should just like go out on their patio and grill out and hang out at a quote unquote safe distance?
I don't remember, but
it was a huge marketing campaign in 2020 or 2021 when people were still taking precautions really seriously. The era that people are talking about when they talk about the mythical lockdown.
Right.
And it was during this period where this was the time where Italy was in an actual lockdown. And people were recommending sheltering in place to everyone who could.
Yeah.
And Oscar Mayer did this thing where they said, yeah, go on your front yard or if you live in an apartment complex, your back patio that's fenced in, and, you know, shout at each other across the street or over the fence. And it was this, within the understanding of the science of the time, it was this be social but still be safe.
Yeah.
Message.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, if I could like spin off of that somewhat, I also think that one of the things that's keeping some lefty people from like engaging with the science of COVID is that they're still stuck in the very, very early protocol surrounding COVID, which was pretty pretty scientifically inaccurate and also really a blunt instrument to try and stop spread without fully understanding what was happening. So I think a lot of people are like, well, we can't shut down forever, and that's what these people want. And it's not. So like, you need to listen to the organizers, you need to listen to what the technology is capable of and really advocate for modern technology forward solutions. In this case, again, ventilation filtration, there's also something called far UVC lights, which destroy pathogens in the air.
Yeah.
We're still figuring out how best to employ that in a way that's going to be fully safe.
And
they're not getting too much exposure to UV.
I hate to sound like I'm defending President Puppet, but Donald Trump was talking about this UV stuff when he was talking about, well, we found that there are ways where light kills it. And people start talking, he
wanted to like shine it in your blood, though. I think he got a little...
Well, that's the whole thing. Yeah. That's the whole thing, is that he would say these weird things that were based on something real. And
I don't think it's any different than like you sit down with like your 80-year-old grandma and tell her something about...
And it's not even... But that's the whole thing, kind of wrong. Is that it ends up being inaccurate, yes.
Yeah.
But... is it any more inaccurate than the ways the media spins things every day?
The media, I think, is the most dangerous source of misinformation about COVID. I think...
do we even call it misinformation anymore? Should we just start calling it lying?
Yeah, it's lies. It's lies. The biggest pieces of misinformation, the biggest lies that you should know about COVID: one, it's fully airborne. Two... I mean, that's the truth. That's not the lie. The lie is that you can avoid it by like standing away from somebody.
6 feet away.
2, getting sick is not good for you. That's not true. 3,
well, I would say getting sick is good for you is the number one lie.
Yeah.
Getting sick is good for you is the big underlying lie that is the excuse for all the other anti-COVID specific lies. And that applies to all the anti-public health stuff. That getting sick is good for you.
It's a really important piece of the foundation of Back to Normal, was normalizing people being sick and getting them to accept it, and also getting them to view it positively. So it's not so much that parents like that their kids are bringing home a different virus every week, but they have a positive way to spin it in their own minds so that they don't start to get worried, which when you think about it is a really evil thing to do to people.
Yeah.
Just like tell them, I know that like intuitively you might feel like, hey, is it maybe not a great thing that my kid is sick every week? But don't worry. Our scientists say that that's good.
It's always been this important part of parenting, though. Spare the rod and spoil the child.
One thing that's interesting, so I'm reading Proust. Maybe I mentioned this last time I was on here, but Proust wrote about his own life and the early books when he's a child. It's like the 1880s, 1890s, and he has asthma. He's chronically ill, and there's no inhalers and there's no drugs. So basically all they do is just sort of send him to the seaside and also have him avoid other people. That's like the big thing they do, is that like there's a big plot line in the first or second book where he wants to go to the theater and his parents are like, well, it's not really safe for you because you could get sick. And it's just interesting to me how intuitive it was to people in that time, and also how normalized it was to say, oh, well, if a kid is vulnerable or if you don't want them to get sick, it's really important to keep them out of like a crowded indoor space. And as we know, a lot of these buildings were built with really good ventilation, and that's also mentioned in the book. So one of the friends of Proust's parents in the book says, I know you were afraid of letting him go to the theater, but the ventilation in there is like really good now. They've like rebuilt it to be really good. So this is something people knew in the 1880s, 1890s.
These were actually arguments, and still are, sadly. Many of these are the actual if people were healthier arguments made by the far right now that were made early on. And it's just how it's come full circle. The same people who didn't want to give up their airy ventilation are the same people who now don't want to require basic ventilation minimums. It's very frustrating that there are so many technological ways to meet this moment
technology that we really didn't have, of course, in previous centuries and decades, and that we're just not using it because people have been brainwashed to decide that it's good for them to get COVID. And I'm sorry, that's a very ridiculous thing to believe.
And you can never over discuss the fact that at every World Economic Forum at Davos, the billionaires themselves have taken every possible COVID precaution.
They did last year. I actually think they might have loosened it this year, but I wouldn't assume all those billionaires are that smart.
I'm not assuming the billionaires are smart at all.
Yeah,
no, I mean, so just go on Twitter every day and
know what they were doing for sure.
You can go on Twitter every day for proof that you don't have to be smart to be a billionaire.
Yeah, it's almost I would say it's a negative.
Yeah, no, I mean it's certainly. So there are different kinds of ability and skill and intelligence, and they don't all intersect with each other. One of the best examples I can think of is Richard Dawkins, who is a great evolutionary scientist and is a terrible, terrible social theorist. Or Sam Harris, who is, though I hear that his credentials have been seriously questioned as well, but Sam Harris, who I have heard praised for his alleged neuroscience ability, is really, really dumb when it comes to social theory. He's like, most people with PhDs in economics are really terrible on the actual history, socially and anthropologically, of what we call the market. So it's really not at all rare for even really smart people, by the definition of society, to be really stupid in multiple areas outside the narrow definition of their intelligence. Whereas popular culture gives us the image of the scientist as polymath, whereas our scientist is a Reed Richards or an Albert Einstein or a Thomas Edison who knows a lot of things about a lot of things.
Right.
As opposed to the narrow specialist that the modern scientist actually is. And even Thomas Edison was not quite the polymath he is made out to be by the history books.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's, of course, a ton of credentialism in the media, but also there's just this
but our culture,
there's this idea that scientists are objective by their nature, and so people can't conceptualize the idea that someone could be a surgeon and also think that poor and weak people should die, even though that's actually quite common. A very common political belief for surgeons who tend to be rich white men who are Republicans.
But our common, I hate it when I lose my train of thought like that. It's my own fault, though. Our common cultural framework leads us to see things in a certain way. And the truth is often at odds with that cultural viewpoint, because that cultural viewpoint is based on ideas like intelligence is a broad thing. People who are smart are smart. Now, there are people who are knowledgeable on a lot of subjects. I'm a generalist. I know a little bit about a lot, but I don't know a lot about anything. And that's an important distinction. I know how to research on a variety of subjects. I can educate myself on a variety of subjects quickly. I can impersonate an expert in certain subjects, but I'm a generalist. I'm a person who knows a little bit about a lot and who's always trying to learn more about everything. And so that means there are going to be limits to everything I know because I'm spreading myself so broadly. Conversely, people who are highly specialized do not have a breadth of general knowledge.
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to the experts that are chosen by mainstream media and are elevated, the most important thing is that they are adherents of the status quo. Like, that's the most important thing. They're never going to pick someone who's in any way radical. So everything else is just sort of layered on top of that. So, like, the most important thing is that they completely agree with the underlying ideology of the press. And then beyond that, they'll find someone who also has whatever degree that they think this person should have to sound authoritative.
Or position of authority, such as the official spokesman for the police, or the chief medical officer of the province of Queensland, or the official spokesperson for the Israeli embassy, and so on.
A big an important thing that they do to construct manufacture consent and construct propaganda narratives is just create ambiguity. So like that's what worked for climate for so long. Instead of talking about how do we address this climate crisis that we know is happening for decades, all the coverage we get is just, is it happening? Is it real? And that's where we are with long COVID right now, is that if you create enough doubt, then that's the only thing that's going to be reported. So look at, for example, when Israel attacked the first hospital in Palestine, instead of the conversation turning to like, should we stop the Israelis from committing genocide and attacking hospitals? It became, but did they really attack
a hospital? And now we've got to the point where the Israelis are rounding people up in hospitals, taking them outside and shooting them, and everybody's acting like it's normal.
And the discourse served its purpose, which was to distract, and it dragged people down into this morass of just endless, pointless debate.
And the atrocities kept happening.
Yeah, and that's happened with climate. That's happening with long COVID. I mean, the function of saying, well, some people think long COVID is real, but some people think it's not, is to give people enough of an out to just say, I'd rather think it's not real.
And again, this is always some people believe the cops are right. Some people believe Israel has a right to defend itself.
Yeah.
Some people believe that it's really important that we stop Putin now or we're going to have a world war.
And actually, even just the phrase, some people, some experts, certain experts, that's a really commonly used phrase in propaganda, and you should really look out for it, because anything that leaves you with more questions than it answers, like who are the experts, what did they say, there's a reason that they're not including which experts they were and what they said. So for example, on NPR, another minimizing piece they did was when they reduced the quarantine period from 10 days to 5 days. And this was done because the CEO of Delta wrote an email to the CDC and said, hey, I kind of need my workers to be back to work a little bit faster than this. And the CDC said, okay, done. And instead of presenting it that way, NPR wrote this little piece, and I linked it in one of my other articles, that basically did both sides. And what it said was, some people say that there might be people who are still contagious after 5 days. And some people say it's, maybe not. And it's like, no, every study shows that the peak period of contagiousness is days like 4 to 8 or something like that. So I think it was over 2/3 of people who get COVID will still be contagious beyond 5 days. But instead of saying the CDC reduces quarantine, even though the vast majority of people who get COVID will still be contagious past this period, they said, some people say this, some people say that. Who can say what is really true? We don't know. And,
you could see the media coverage about Ukraine go from these people in the National Guard are Nazis to some people say these people in the National Guard are Nazis to what Nazis?
Yeah. And we also saw
and that's undeniable, regardless of what your position on what's actually happening in the Ukraine is. The media coverage changed completely to conform to the policy choice.
A good example too is the blowing up the Nord Stream pipeline. So if you go back and look at the media coverage of that, it's really similar to WMDs. It's really similar to, did Israel blow up a hospital? And the way it's covered was, we don't know who did it. Some people say we did it. Some people say Russia did it, but like it was probably Russia. And it turned out Russia didn't do that. But by the time that it came out that Russia did not blow up its own pipeline, by the way, that it makes money off of, never really made sense. By the time that came out, the news cycle had moved on. And there had been enough ambiguity that everyone was like, I mean, who can really say, but also probably Russia did it. So, and that's not to defend Russia. That's to say that's just factually not what happened. And they chose not to report what happened.
If you wanted to go by a strict who benefits analysis, the people who have benefited the most from the Nord Stream pipeline being blown up are France and Norway. France, because they've started selling massive amounts of nuclear energy across the border to Germany. And Norway, because they've been the chief recipient of all the oil money that was going to Russia. And so they've become massively wealthier because the Nord Stream pipeline blew up, and nobody puts any propaganda out there. What if it was?
It never made sense to think that Russia did it. But again, it's all about just creating this sense of ambiguity, and also sometimes kind of casting the side that they don't want to be believed as conspiracy theorists. So that was done with Nord Stream. It was done with the hospital, and it was done. It's absolutely being done with long COVID.
And it's done all the. It's what they did. It's what they did to the guy who proved all the evidence of the CIA connection to the crack epidemic in American cities. They said, "Oh, he's nuts." Some people say he's lying. Some people say he's mentally ill. Some people say, and he ended up killing himself.
Oh wow.
That's another Semmelweis for you. The person who proved the connection between the CIA and the crack epidemic, the so-called crack epidemic, I really should say, but the person who proved the CIA crack connection was essentially blacklisted from the journalism industry and killed himself. Allegedly killed himself. He may have been murdered. But if you suggest he was murdered, you're a conspiracy theorist. You see where I'm going?
Well, we just saw that the murder
the
of
Boeing guy who
conveniently
died.
The Boeing guy is really disturbing case. I should probably.
We should probably be. Yeah, we've been 2 hours, so we should wrap up. Do you have any final thoughts?
Final thoughts.
Final promotions.
Yeah. So check out www. I have to include the www because of something to do with getting my domain through Substack. Anyway, www.thegauntlet.news. Subscribe if you can afford it. Pay to subscribe. And I also, like I mentioned, I have Gauntlet News on Instagram now, and I'm going to be resharing all kinds of like COVID safe events, COVID safe info, infographics, studies. So also if you are part of like a COVID, like a mask blog, anything like that, if you follow me, I'll follow you back and I'll share, through that platform. So that's all the sort of salesmanship stuff. But on the topic of propaganda, I would just say to leftists, like, again, if you aren't familiar with the disability community, if you have said nothing as disabled people are murdered by the state for 4 years, this is your time to sit back and listen to disabled people and to learn from them, not to mock them. One, and it will really serve you well, because right now what you're doing is that you're on the fast train to disability, and you don't want to arrive at the station and have no idea what you're about to go through because you think that the state comes and brings you dinner every night and gives you a little kiss on the head and then just tucks you into your free housing. That's all not true. And it's like very right-wing messaging. Everybody should be doing what they can to mitigate the spread of COVID in our communities. Everybody should be doing everything that they can to help protect each other and participate in community care. You can look up what mask block is closest to you to get involved. It's a really great space to be in right now. It's really exciting. It's from the ground up. It's largely being run by disabled people, by queer people. I got to give a shout out to the queer communities that are standing so closely in solidarity with the disabled communities, especially the trans community, which, as we all know, has been very, very under attack over the last few years. And I will tell you that trans people are highly, highly, highly overrepresented in these organizing groups, because they understand what it's like to be targeted by the state. They understand that it's all of us or none of us. They understand that if the rights of disabled people to be in public spaces are removed, that they can be next. And also, of course, there's a ton of overlap also in terms of like being medicalized and being harmed by the medical community. So please join us in this radical movement to really protect each other and care for each other. I promise that it's worth more than sitting in the indoor part of the restaurant. And I promise that you're going to learn a lot. And solidarity forever.
And there should be solidarity between disabled people and essential workers because we're sharing the same risks. If you're not,
they're the same people also.
And often we are the same people.
And like I mentioned, essential workers they really have been getting long COVID for the longest and at the highest rates.
The business I work for my role was classified as essential because it's related to quote unquote infrastructure. Now I work in commercial lighting controls, and in the worst case scenario, the emergency lights are going to come on in most of these places. It's not really that terrible, but that's essential under the economic conditions of our society. Whereas, the CEO who's making billions of dollars, he doesn't have to come into the office.
Yeah. I mean, you can't. The thing I would also like to mention is just that you cannot silo these people out of your movements. You literally cannot, because people are joining the other side of people who've been harmed by COVID every single day. Frontline workers are at the highest risk, and we see it among nurses, among school teachers. We're seeing this really, really drastic shortages in frontline workers. We're seeing drastic numbers of sick days among all workers. I wrote a piece a couple of weeks ago about how the average worker in Germany needed 20 sick days last year, which was a record. We're also seeing similarly in the UK. They just did a bunch of reporting about how their long-term sick leave numbers are higher than they've ever been. And they're blaming the people who are sick, saying they're claiming to be sick. They've got millions and millions of people out on long-term sick leave. This is destroying the working class.
And
it is disabling us.
This is big lie. This is big lie number 4. And this is something else that goes back to the center of all this. This is fundamental to the ruling class's image of the working class. Big lie number 4. Most people who say they're sick are lying.
Really important to unpack your own need to assume that disabled people aren't actually disabled, because there's a really, really long history of right-wing thought about malingering and faking and being hysterical and lying. I can promise you there is not a single person who would rather be bedbound than have a full and active life. It is not fun. And your need to ascribe to this right-wing fascist talking point, all it's about, again, is about demonizing people who are unable to be fully productive and turning you against them. The same way that they turn, working class Americans against immigrants coming into the country and saying, well, it's because of them. This is the exact same.
It's another way. It's another way we are made to operate against our own best interests.
Absolutely.
No more
demonizing these people when you may end up being one of them if you
continue to get reinfected with COVID. Here's the thing. Disability and old age together are the two unique identities that will still be shared by everyone and are thus universal. If you live long enough, you will get old. Yep. If you live long enough, you will become disabled. Or, more accurately, most people, and I hate to overgeneralize like this, because then it sounds like I'm not giving the most disabled people their just due, and that's not my intention. Most people will deal with some sort of disability at some point in their life, even if it is not a quote-unquote major disability. Even if it does not lead to them in a wheelchair or in crutches, they will experience more dizziness when they stand up than they did when they were younger. They will experience more pain in their joints than they did when they were younger. They will get tired faster than they did when they were younger. Even when they are healthy and maintain excellent physical fitness for their age, even when they're leaving younger people in the dust, they are still less healthy than they would have been when they were younger.
Right.
They will be relatively disabled based on their previous experience, even when they deny it.
And that was true before COVID, but it's particularly true now because COVID drastically increases your risk of disability, and you think you're going to get it every year and not end up disabled. It doesn't make sense. It's not adding up. So
even before COVID, it was more common to have occasional issues of brain fog or executive function failure. And I'm just talking about little short things, not chronic stuff, or just hurting too much to get up in the morning, that we associate with old age. And all of this stuff actually starts, sometimes as early as your 30s for some people, sometimes in your 40s, and gets progressively worse over your life than magically starting at age 65.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, I should wrap it up, but thank you so much for having me.
No, and my final thought, and you can feel free to go if you need to. That's my thought. But my final thoughts and promotions are in this order. First, I want to give a shout out to I hate it again when I can't talk. Why is this happening to me? I want to give a shout out to Justine Barron, who was originally my first choice to be on this show. No offense, Julia, but who is going to have surgery in April, and who is someone else who, if you can afford to subscribe to their Substack and pay for it, please do. As with Julia, if you can afford to subscribe to her Substack and pay for it, please do. Justine is a crime reporter who literally wrote the book about the Freddie Gray cover-up in Baltimore, but who is also a survivor of MCAS preceding COVID, whose problems have been greatly exacerbated by COVID, and who writes a lot about disability. And so I had specifically chosen her because of the intersection between the police stuff and the COVID stuff. So I want to give everybody a shout out. Justine Barron is someone to follow and support. Do a search for her on Substack and look for Jewenstein 3000 on Twitter. My promotion, of course, is I really want to be able to pay people like Julia and Justine for the work they're doing myself. And for that, I need people to pay me for my work. I hate to ask for money. But the fact is, because of the admittedly target demographic of my work, it is more likely for one of my patrons to become homeless. This is something that has happened, and not be able to support the show anymore than it is for me to get a new patron. If you can afford to become a patron, please do. If you cannot afford to become a patron, please consider a Cash App payment or a PayPal payment at one time every now and then. The links for that stuff are on my Twitter. I hate to ask for money, but it's getting to the point where at some point I have to consider whether I can afford to pay for my streaming software. And please help if you can. And then my final thought after getting the promotion out of the way is back to the thought of identity that I was saying, is old age and disability are levelers. We are all going to be, to some extent, disabled at some point in our life, even just compared to our capabilities when we were younger, because of the nature of aging and the physical body. And if we live long enough, we will become seriously disabled, because that's just how it works. This has become, like Julia says, this has become greatly increased by COVID, which means all of the things that were true before COVID about disability justice are more true after COVID, which means it is even more likely to affect you sooner than it was this same time 5 years ago. Plus, you're 5 years older than you were 5 years ago. So you're 5 years more likely to start having these issues anyway. And keep this in mind when you think about these questions of disability justice. How disabled are you compared to where you used to be? How disabled are you going to be 10 years from now? Because more than anything else, physical health and ability is a spectrum rather than a hard yes or no. You don't wake up one day and magically become disabled. This is part of a process that has probably already started for you. And those are my final thoughts. I hope that that these shows really help somebody. I want to keep getting this out. Thank you for coming on the show, Julia. Thank you, everyone who watched. I've seen that it's been a good audience today. I really appreciate that. I hope everybody has a great week, and I'll tweet at you.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
Bye-bye.